My mother raised her wine glass at Thanksgiving and smiled around the table before saying, "One daughter is a lawyer, the other is a beggar." The table exploded with laughter. I was the beggar. I paid my own rent, bought my own groceries, and had never asked my mother to cover a single bill. I was the beggar because, for years, she had trained everyone to see me that way. So I smiled, passed the potatoes, and waited. 20 minutes later, my mother stood again to praise my older sister. This time, I set down my fork and asked one question. My sister's face drained white. Mom's hand froze around her glass. And that was when I learned my mother's cruelest lie had never really been about me. My name is Mara Bennett. I was 38 that Thanksgiving and I worked as a floral designer. I created wedding arches, table arrangements, bouquets, and installations that could transform an ordinary room into something unforgettable. But to my mother Diane, my career was always that little flower thing. My sister Elise was different. Elise was 42, a lawyer, and the daughter my mother loved introducing before anyone even asked, "She's in law," Mom would say proudly. Those words opened doors. My work usually required an explanation. I learned the difference early. When I was 17, I won an art award at school. It was nothing enormous, just a certificate with my name printed across the top and a blue ribbon attached to the corner. I carried it home inside a plastic folder so it wouldn't bend. Mom was slicing apples at the kitchen counter when I showed her. "That's nice, honey. 3 seconds, that was all I got." Then Elise walked through the door and announced she had been accepted into a summer business program. Mom dropped the knife, hugged her, and asked a dozen questions. My certificate stayed on the counter beside the apple peels. I remember staring at it while Elise talked. That was the first time I learned to make my happiness smaller before someone else could do it for me. My grandmother Evelyn was the exception. She used to sit beside me while I sketched flowers at her kitchen table and tell me that making something beautiful was not a waste of a life. After she died, I kept her pearl earrings. I wore them on days when I needed to remember that one person had understood me. My father, Thomas, understood enough to soften things. But he had been gone. After his death, Mom stopped having anyone around who challenged her comparisons. Elise had the career, I had the hobby, Elise had ambition. I was still figuring things out. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Mom called to confirm I was coming. Before hanging up, she said, "Wear something nice, Elise is coming straight from the city." I looked at Grandma Evelyn's pearls on my dresser. Even then, I knew which daughter my mother wanted. Everyone noticed. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I was wiring white roses into a centerpiece at my studio when a woman named Rebecca Morgan came in to collect flowers for a corporate dinner. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a sharp gray suit, with the calm voice of someone who noticed everything without making people uncomfortable. While I wrapped the arrangement, she asked whether I had siblings. "I have an older sister," I said. "Her name is Elise, she's a lawyer." Rebecca's hands paused. "Elise Bennett?" I nodded. Something changed in her expression. "I thought she left her firm earlier this year." My fingers stopped moving. "No, she's still there. At least that was what Mom had been telling everyone." Rebecca immediately looked uncomfortable. "I may be remembering wrong. Anything I know professionally isn't mine to share." Then she added quietly, "But some things are public." That sentence followed me home. I hated myself a little for searching. At first it felt petty, like I was trying to find proof that Elise wasn't as perfect as everyone believed. But what I found didn't feel satisfying. It felt wrong. Elise had left her firm almost 6 months earlier. Around the same time, the firm had undergone an internal review involving questionable billing practices and disputed adjustments totaling roughly $200,000. Nothing I found proved Elise had committed a crime. Nothing said she had been charged, but her departure had happened during the review, and Mom had never mentioned a word. Just the week before, she had told Aunt Rachel that Elise was busier than ever. I closed my laptop. Maybe Elise was embarrassed. Maybe she needed time. I understood that. What I didn't understand was the lie. A few days later, my cousin Nora texted me. "Can we meet? Just us." We sat in a small neighborhood cafe where the espresso machine hissed every few minutes and nobody cared about our family. Nora barely touched her coffee, then she unlocked her phone. "There's something I should have shown you a long time ago. It was a family group chat. a group chat I wasn't part of. There were jokes about my apartment, pictures of my floral arrangements, and comments about my creative phase. Elise had participated, Mom had reacted with laughing emojis that hurt. But then Nora scrolled farther. I saw a message from Elise thanking Mom for helping with rent. Then another message from Mom asking everyone not to mention Elise's work situation at Thanksgiving. I looked up. How long has Mom been helping her? Nora swallowed. Since May, I stared at the screen. Mom had spent months calling me unstable while quietly paying Elise's rent. Suddenly, before she ever called me a beggar, I understood exactly where the joke had come from. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed with Nora's screenshots open on my phone. I wasn't angry at Elise for needing help. I was angry that Mom had turned her struggle into a secret while turning my independence into something shameful. For the first time, I realized I wasn't ashamed of my apartment, my career, or my life. I was ashamed that I had allowed my mother to teach me to be ashamed of them. I printed the messages Nora had given me permission to keep. Then I made a simple timeline. May, Elise leaves her firm, May through November. Mom helps cover Elise's rent and bills, summer. Mom tells relatives Elise is thriving. November, Mom tells me I need to become more responsible. I stared at those 4 lines, then I made a decision. I wouldn't expose Elise, I wouldn't start a fight. But if Mom used me as a punchline again, I would stop protecting the lie that made the joke possible. Thanksgiving morning, Mom called before 8. Can you bring something for the table? What do you need? Flowers, make it look nice. I almost laughed. The career she treated like a hobby was suddenly useful when guests were coming. Still, I made the centerpiece: white roses, eucalyptus, dark red berries, and a few autumn branches. By noon, my studio smelled like wet stems and cold greenery. Before leaving, I slipped Grandma Evelyn's pearls around my neck. Then I placed the printed pages inside my bag. I wasn't going to Thanksgiving looking for a war. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into that house defenseless. By 5:30, people were packed around Mom's dining room table. The house smelled like turkey, butter, cinnamon, and the pine candles she lit every Thanksgiving. My centerpiece sat proudly in the middle of the table. Aunt Rachel leaned over it and smiled. "This is beautiful, Mara." Before I could answer, Mom said, "She's always been good with little creative things, little." There it was again. I took my seat and folded my napkin across my lap. Elise sat 3 chairs away in a cream sweater, looking polished enough to walk into a courtroom. If you didn't know better, you would never guess. She hadn't worked at her firm in months. Dinner started normally. Football hummed from the living room. Forks scraped plates. Someone complained about airport traffic. An uncle told the same story everyone had heard twice before. Then Mom tapped her spoon against her wine glass. Everyone looked up. She smiled. "I have so much to be thankful for, especially my daughters." My stomach tightened. She turned toward Elise. "One daughter is a lawyer." Elise gave a small, uncomfortable smile. Then Mom looked directly at me. "The other is a beggar." For half a second, nobody moved. Then laughter broke around the table. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Uncle David laughed into his napkin. Someone near the end whispered, "Linda." Mom laughed hardest. "Oh, come on, Mara knows I'm kidding." Heat crawled up my neck, my fingers tightened around my fork. Every part of me wanted to answer. Instead, I smiled. "Sure, Mom." The laughter faded. Dinner continued, but I didn't. I chewed turkey. I couldn't taste and listen to people talk around me as if nothing had happened. 20 minutes later, dessert arrived: pumpkin pie, coffee, whipped cream from a can because Mom always insisted homemade was too much trouble. Uncle David looked toward Elise. "So, how's work going?" Elise opened her mouth. Mom interrupted. "Let's not talk shop tonight. She works too hard as it is." Elise stared at her plate. That was the moment something inside me settled. It didn't explode, it settled. Mom stood again and lifted her glass. "One more toast," she announced. She smiled at Elise. "To our brilliant lawyer." I placed my fork beside my plate. The tiny sound cut through the conversation. Elise looked at me. Mom did too. I met my mother's eyes. "If I'm the beggar, Mom, why have you been paying Elise's rent since May?" Silence. Real silence. I could hear the coffee machine clicking in the kitchen. Elise's face drained white. Mom's hand stopped halfway to her mouth. Aunt Rachel looked from me to Mom. Nobody laughed. And for the first time in my life, the daughter everyone expected to stay quiet had finally spoken. Mom recovered animo. This is not the time I looked at her. You made it the time when you called me a beggar, Elise whispered. Mara, don't I turn toward her? I'm not ashamed that you needed help. Her eyes lifted slowly. I mean that. Then I looked back at Mom. What I'm ashamed of is that you knew Elise was struggling, helped her quietly, and still spent months using her life to make mine look worthless. Mom's mouth tightened. You're jealous. No. I reached into my bag and placed 3 printed pages beside my plate. I'm not exposing Elise. I'm not accusing her of anything. These only show what you already knew. Mom stared at the papers. You knew Elise left her firm. You knew you were covering her rent and bills, and you still told everyone she was thriving while telling people I was unstable. Mom's voice sharpened. How dare you embarrass your sister like this? Aunt Rachel spoke before I could. Linda, stop. Mom turned toward her. Rachel didn't look away. She didn't create this. Those words landed harder than anything I could have said. Elise lowered her head. Nobody knew what to say. I stood. My knees were shaking, but my voice wasn't. You don't have to admire my life. You don't have to understand my work. But you will never use me as a joke again. Mom said my name. I picked up my coat. She called again. Mara, I kept walking. The pearl earrings felt cold against my skin as I stepped onto the porch. For the first time, leaving that house didn't feel like losing my family. It felt like leaving the role they had written for me. My phone started buzzing before I reached my apartment. First came the family group message, then individual texts, then silence from the people I expected to hear from most. One cousin wrote, "You could have handled that privately." Another said, "Your mom was joking." I stared at that message for a long time. That word again. Joking, as if adding laughter to cruelty somehow erased the cruelty. I turned my phone face down and made tea. My apartment looked exactly as I had left it that morning, the dried lavender, the secondhand chairs, the pruning shears beside the sink. Nothing had changed, and somehow everything had. The next morning, Aunt Rachel called. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. I should have said something years ago. I didn't answer immediately. She continued, "We all knew Linda compared you two. We told ourselves it was harmless because you always laughed." She paused. I laughed because nobody else stopped her. I closed my eyes. Then Rachel said, "I'm sorry. It wasn't a magical apology. It didn't erase 17 years of comparisons, but it mattered. Someone had finally named what happened without asking me to soften it." Elise didn't contact me for 4 days. When she finally did, her message contained one sentence. "You could have protected me." I read it twice, then I typed, "I spent years protecting everyone but myself. I didn't add anything else. I didn't tell her she deserved what happened. I didn't bring up her firm. I didn't share her situation online. Whatever consequences Elise faced, professionally belonged to Elise, not me." That was a line I refused to cross. Mom was different. Her first message was nearly a page long. She said I had humiliated her, ruined Thanksgiving, and put Elise in an impossible position. Then came the sentence I had heard my entire life. "I was only trying to help you." I finally understood something. Mom believed. Comparison was motivation. She thought shame would push me toward a life she could brag about. And because I had tolerated it for so long, she had mistaken my silence for permission. This time, I knew exactly what I needed to say. I read Mom's message 3 times before answering. Then I wrote only what I needed to say. "If you want a relationship with me, 3 things stop now. No comparing me to Elise, no jokes about my work or money, and no discussing my life with relatives as if I'm a problem you're managing." I stared at the screen before pressing send. Mom didn't reply that day. Or the next. The silence hurt more than I expected. For years, I had imagined that if I finally stood up for myself, I would feel powerful. Instead, I felt empty. Then I remembered something Grandma Evelyn had once told me while we sat at her kitchen table. "Being understood is wonderful, Mara, but you cannot build your whole life waiting for someone else to understand you." I hadn't understood those words. Then I did now. A few weeks later, I wrote an essay. I didn't use names. I didn't mention Elise's firm, seeing her rent, or anything that could identify her. I wrote about growing up in a house where one child became the measuring stick and the other became the warning. I wrote about how praise can become a weapon when it is constantly used to compare siblings. I wrote about learning to make my happiness smaller. A small local arts organization shared the essay. Then they invited me to read it at an evening event. There were maybe 40 people in the room, nothing glamorous, folding chairs, a cheap microphone, paper cups filled with coffee. But when I stood near the stage, my hands began shaking. I touched Grandma Evelyn's pearl earrings. For a moment, I remembered being 17, holding that little blue ribbon certificate while Mom celebrated Elise. I almost laughed at how long I had carried that moment. Then my name was announced. I stepped forward, the room became silent. Not the silence from Thanksgiving. That silence had been shock. This one was attention. Nobody was waiting to laugh. Nobody was comparing me with anyone. They were simply listening, so I began reading. My voice trembled during the first few sentences, then it became steadier. I told them what it felt like to be the daughter whose achievements were always described as cute, creative, or temporary. I told them how difficult it was to realize that the person who taught you to doubt yourself might never admit she had done it. And I told them something I had only recently learned. Your worth does not become smaller because someone refuses to recognize it. When I finished, nobody spoke for a second. Then the room filled with applause. I looked down because I suddenly felt tears burning my eyes. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving Mom wrong. It was simply the first time I had stood in a room full of strangers and felt completely comfortable being myself. Afterward, a woman approached me. She told me she had spent 30 years believing her sister was the successful one. Then she smiled. I finally realized we were just living different lives. I thanked her. On the drive home, I thought about Elise. I still loved my sister, but loving someone didn't mean protecting every secret they asked me to carry. It didn't mean allowing Mom to use me as a warning so Elise could remain the family's success story. And it certainly didn't mean destroying myself to keep everyone else comfortable. When I arrived home, I removed Grandma Evelyn's pearls carefully. I placed them beside the vase of dried lavender. Then I looked around my small apartment. For years, I had thought this place proved Mom right. Small simples, unimpressive. Now I saw something completely different. It was mine. Every chair, every plate, every flower vase, every bill paid, every dream built without applause. And suddenly, I realized I'd been waiting for permission to be proud of a life I had already earned. I didn't need permission anymore. Months passed after Thanksgiving. Mom and I didn't suddenly become close. There was no dramatic apology at my doorstep, no tearful family reunion, and no magical moment when everything from my childhood disappeared. Real life wasn't that simple, but something had changed. The comparison stopped, the jokes stopped, and when relatives asked Mom about me, she finally learned to say my name without turning it into a comparison. Elise eventually found temporary work outside her old firm. We spoke occasionally. Our relationship was awkward at first, but slowly, carefully, it became more honest. One afternoon, she came to my studio. She stood among buckets of roses and eucalyptus watching me work. "I'm sorry," she said. "I kept trimming a stem." "For what?" "For helping Mom believe she could treat you that wall." I looked at her. She continued. "I knew she compared us. I liked being the daughter she bragged about. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. I put the scissors down." "Thank you for saying that." She nodded. Neither of us pretended everything was fixed, but for the first time, we weren't standing on opposite sides of Mom's comparison. We were standing beside each other. Mom took longer. She finally apologized months later. Not perfectly. There were still explanations mixed into it. She said she had always wanted the best for me. She said she thought teasing made me stronger. She said she never realized how deeply her words had affected me. I listened, then I told her something I wish I had said years earlier. "You don't have to understand my life. You just have to respect it." She nodded. That was all. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was an honest one. I never became a lawyer. I never wanted to. I became better at my work. My floral business grew slowly. A few months after the Thanksgiving incident, I was hired to design flowers for a large wedding at a historic hotel. There were 12-foot arches covered in white roses and eucalyptus. When the bride walked into the room, she covered her mouth and cried, "It's exactly what I imagined," she whispered. I smiled. That moment mattered, not because my mother would have been impressed, because I was. Later that evening, I returned home and found Grandma Evelyn's pearls waiting on my dresser. I picked them up and smiled. For years, I had worn them because they reminded me that one person in my family had believed in me. Now I wore them for another reason. They reminded me that I had finally learned to believe in myself. I used to think peace would come when Mom admitted I was enough. I was wrong. Peace came when I stopped needing her to decide I didn't win because Elise struggled. I didn't win because Mom was exposed, and I certainly didn't win because Thanksgiving ended with everyone choosing my side. I won because I stopped letting someone else turn my life into evidence that another person was better. That was the real victory. Sometimes family love becomes tangled with control, comparison, shame, and expectations. Sometimes the person who says they are helping you is actually teaching you to doubt yourself. And sometimes setting a boundary feels cruel only because you were trained to believe silence was kindness. My life never needed permission to matter. Neither does yours. So if someone has spent years making you feel like the lesser child, the weaker sibling, or the disappointment in the family, remember this. Their opinion is not your identity. You do not have to become someone else to deserve respect. You do not have to destroy another person to prove your own worth. And you never have to laugh when someone hurts you, just because they call it a joke. That Thanksgiving, my mother raised a glass to the daughter she believed was better. I raised nothing. I simply told the truth, and somehow, that was enough to change my life. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel for more emotional family stories. If you liked the video, give it a like and leave a sweet comment telling us what you would have done in Mara's place. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more stories like this.